I'd like to thank everybody for joining us for the second lecture in the Art History Lecture Series in the School of Art at the University of Arkansas. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Nancy Marie Mithlo. Dr. Mithlo is currently a professor of gender studies and an affiliated faculty with the American Indian Studies Center, and the interdepartment program at the University of California, Los Angeles. Her research focuses on global indigenous movements in the art and the cultural, institutional, and political systems that mask or normalize bias. She has authored or edited numerous publications. Her CV is quite intimidating. It took a while to weed through it, to look through it. So I'll highlight a few of these publications. In 2009, she published Our Indian Princess, Subverting the Stereotype. In 2011, Manifestations, New Native American Criticism. In 2014, For the Love of His People, the photography of Horace Pula. And this year, just a few months ago, she released a new book published by Nebraska University Press, is that accurate? Knowing Native Arts, a book that addresses the significance of Indigenous arts in local and in global menus. I'm also excited to see that another book is under contract with State University of New York Press, Radical Curating, 20 Years of Indigenous Art Practice at the Venice Biennale. This is a product of her 20 years of experience curating exhibitions of Indigenous art practices at the Venice Biennale. And according to the description, it chronicles the movement of Indigenous peoples on a global stage as representatives of artist collective, tribal nations, and pan-tribal educational institutions. Prior to joining UCLA, she was an associate professor of art history and visual arts at Occidental College and chair of American Indian Studies at the Autry Museum of American West. That was in 2014 to 2018. She's also been served as an associate professor of art history and American Indian Studies at the University of Wisconsin, which is where I had the pleasure to meet her, along with an assistant professor in the anthropology department at Smith College. She received her BA in anthropology and art at Appalachian State University in 1986, and an MA and a PhD at Stanford in anthropology in 1988 and 1993, respectively. The topic of tonight's discussion is Native Arts Visual Remix, and she will be in discussion with her PhD student, Clementine Bordeaux, from the University of California, New Mexico. We had hoped to share with you our land acknowledgement statement that is still in the works, but it should be ready shortly, hopefully for our next lecture series. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mithlo.
Thank you so much, Janine. Hello, everyone. Inju, Nitagote. I'm Nancy Marie Mithlo. I'm speaking to you from Los Angeles, traditional territory of the Tongva and Gabrielino peoples. My tribe, the Fort Sill Chiricahua Apache tribe, is located both in Oklahoma and New Mexico. So I have a great affinity for the Southeast. I am very excited to see all the programs that are bubbling up at the University of Arkansas, and just thrilled to be sharing with you today. I wanted to give a special shout out to Sean Touton, to Kay Yandel, and the Indigenous Studies program at the University of Arkansas. We all met at University of Wisconsin-Madison also. We were faculty at the same time there. And Janine, as you mentioned, I was on your dissertation committee. So this is really kind of like we're all coming back together again, and what a wonderful opportunity. Thank you, John, for the invitation today. So John Blickinger will be heading up the Q&A at the end of this presentation. I'm really excited today to be sharing with you just some major takeaways, primarily from the Knowing Native Arts book, and to have Clementine Bordeaux, who is a colleague, and we're working together now on Clementine's graduate degree in discussion with me. So the platform that we're going to be using is, I'm planning to switch to a PowerPoint right now. I'm going to segue a little bit. And instead of me just sort of lecturing to you, Clementine and I will talk over some of the main issues. But just to set this up, I'll be introducing two artists to you today. Emily Arthur, who is a printmaker, and Tom Jones, a photographer. They are both professors at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So woohoo, state schools, big state schools, shout out. But you know, while I'm celebrating our mutual connections through the educational institution, I'm also really questioning institutions. And so if people ask, what do? I pretty much say I do an institutional critique. I'm looking at the actions of Native artists and curators in light of genocidal histories and ongoing colonial traumas. So the two platforms tonight will be an archive as evidence. And within that, I'll be looking at the contrast picture and also strategies of appropriation, and in particular, strategies that involve scale. And I want to say as background, this book, I really feel like I'm more of a witness. And I want to declare witnessing as a little separate from biography or testimonial. So in our field, the field of Native arts, there are just still many, many challenges, and they have to do with arts equity. And often I think, we are told that if we, complete the mark, if we make the grade, we get the graduate degree, we get the professorship, we do the shows, we have the recognition, that institutional change will just come about. And I think what we've witnessed is that that's actually not happening. So I was tracking back, and I hope Sean is online now, because we participated together in something called the Future of Minority Studies. And I want to say this was, Sean, 15, 20 years ago. It's been a while that we did that. It was funded by the Mellon Foundation. We met at Cornell, we met in Madison. There are a couple of different, Stanford, I think, was in the group too. And we were theorizing race with a group of scholars. And what this group of scholars had as their platform was, just at the moment at which there was a concentration, a significant number of scholars of race in US academies, the frame shifted and it became identity politics, and that was all thrown out the window. Like, you can't theorize race. And so what I'm looking at within the field of Native arts is something a little similar. There's sort of a shifting frame of reference of within an institution and outside of the institution. So when there's headway made within the institution, like the National Museum of the American Indian, then there tends to be kind of like but the artist gets to be able to self-identify. The artist is the authority, so these shifting frames in which it's really frustrating and you feel like you can't really get a foothold. It's a theme. And I want us to kind of think about those themes as we look at these artists and we look at the strategies. I'm just going to close by saying, before I go to my PowerPoint, within the book, there are all kinds of little explosions. And I feel like I need to say this out loud because I'm not getting like a full-hearted critique. I feel like maybe people don't want to hear what I have to say. But there are explosions everywhere. And so if you're reading the book and you want to reach out to me and say, I think I found one of these, then please do. That would actually be a lot of fun. Okay, I'm screen sharing with you, and I'm hoping that this will be fluid and smooth. Okay, so Clementine, are you there? All right, I'm going to ask you to put your audio on, and yes. I'm going to do where are we? Slideshow. Yay. Okay, great. So I'm starting on this piece by Tom Jones. Tom Jones is a Ho-Chunk photographer. He and I were co-curators of the Horace Pulaw show that is still traveling, even though we were shut down with COVID. It's, I think it's supposed to open in Agua Caliente next year. Horace Pula is known as one of the first professional Native American photographers. He's Kiowa. Wonderful teamwork on that exhibit. So Tom's work is in a variety of different genres in photography. I mean, people actually, I think, associate his work primarily with portraiture. And I encourage you to go online and look at Tom Jones Ho-Chunk to see all of his different bodies of work. And this just happens to be one, a series that's titled The North American Landscape. And you'll probably note this classic sepia-toned photo next door to Tom's piece, which is an Edward S. Curtis. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on Curtis. If you don't know who he is, then look him up. You'll find plenty of information out there. Mostly Native artists are asked to respond to Curtis, sort of as an afterthought. It was a review 20 plus years ago that said, please stop exhibiting Curtis, everyone just stop it. But here we have a Native artist who is appropriating off of this ethnographic norm. And if you look at this series online, and I encourage you to go look at this, basically he's using as his language these miniature toys. And I'll show you at the end of the presentation another use of Tom Jones and how he mobilizes the miniature to make statements about truth and reality and our ideas of sort of authenticity and pureness. So I don't know, Clementine, did you have anything here that you want to maybe toss around?
Yeah, I think, again, and you're going to go into it later, but this idea of having to be reactive as opposed to proactive in our responses to the way these narratives and images have been created of Indigenous people in North America. So I think Tom Jones's work is really exciting in that it's kind of turning these things, you know, around on its head. So, but yeah, Nancy, keep going.
Yeah, and in a playful manner. I mean, just the sense of humor here is 100% Native, right? So I'm shifting into the other artist that I'll be discussing, which is Emily Arthur, and I'll show you her piece. Well, actually, let me just go ahead and forward. This is the piece that I'll be discussing, Re-Remembering Not History. And so the background of this is an exhibit that was traveling. It just stopped, I want to say 2 years ago. It went to 10 different locations, rewriting history from the Southern Plains to Matanzas Bay. This was curated by 3 Native artists. So some of those are still at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, our theme for this evening. John Hitchcock and Emily Arthur both teach there, and Marwin Begay, who's at the University of Oklahoma. And what they ended up doing, Emily was teaching in North Florida, and it became apparent that they were doing a commemoration of St. Augustine, the 450th anniversary. And they did not plan any Native telling of history. It was just not on the agenda. While in St. Augustine, there's something that's called Castillo De San Marcos, and it's a National Park Service site. So you can Google that. It was known as Fort Marion. And this is a place where from 1875 to 1878, you can see all these Cheyenne, Kiowa, Comanche, Arapaho, and Caddo leaders were jailed, really for doing nothing more than basically living a traditional lifestyle on the plains. And so these 3 curators, Native artists, invited 72 artists, Native and non-Natives, to contribute on the scale of a ledger drawing paper, an individual contribution. And what was great about this show is that it created the space within the commemoration in the city of St. Augustine that did not exist before. So here's an example of several state institutions, arts and cultural institutions, basically saying, we're not even going to talk about genocide. And here a group of Native artists and curators saying, oh, well, we'll get some money, we'll organize this thing, and we'll travel it around the country to 2 different locations. St. Augustine is important to me because this is a place where my family and my tribe was also held as prisoners of war. So the Chiricahua Apache suffered through 28 years of basically political indefinite detainment, incarceration. So I think this dialogue is very pertinent today. The exhibit is no longer traveling, but there is a catalog that is being sold, and you can look on my website for more information. So Clementine, what do you think about this show and this kind of intervention?
Yeah, well, I was going to pull a quote from your book. You state, art is our intervention into those places and connections that are typically not included in the museum enterprise. And I think that is such a apt way of stating what you just stated, but in thinking about how we, again, are creating these narratives about our past experiences of our communities that aren't settled or placed in a museum or institutional space. And I think art really does that in really fascinating and encouraging ways. It's one thing that why I continue to turn to artists and art makers is because they're imagining this history in a different form and a different narrative that doesn't always agree with these institutional settings like a museum or even a state park or a university. So I'm really thankful that we have these places to be able to discuss these narratives that still have a lasting impact on our experiences today.
So I've neglected to introduce Clementine, who is a curator and a theater activist and so many other things. So give me half a minute and just let me say something. So we've already talked about Clementine's a doctoral student. The department is World Arts and Cultures Department. She was raised on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota and is enrolled in the Rosebud Sioux Tribe. Clementine sits on the board of Cornerstone Theater Company and is a collaborator for Racing Magpie Arts Consulting Organization in South Dakota. And I know you do even more than this, Clementine. Do you want to say something briefly about Racing Magpie? Because I'm such a fan.
Yeah, Racing Magpie is an organization that my sister and brother-in-law started here. I'm currently located in Mini-Luzaha-Otuahe, which is Rapid City, South Dakota. And they started this arts organization first as gallery space and studios, but like a lot of smaller organizations during the pandemic, they've had to really downsize, but they do a lot of consulting in the region and nationally to just bring attention to Indigenous artists in the Northern Plains area. And so I have the fortune to be able to support them and collaborate a lot with my sister, Mary Bordeaux. And so I'm always really eager and excited to share what Racing Magpie does, because I think in what aligning with what your talk is today, Nancy, is just these places that artists create for themselves when the museum or state or university or national institutions fail to hold narratives that are relevant and current, or even that think about the future of Indigenous artists as relevant. I think places like Racing Magpie do that.
Yeah, I'm so excited about the future of Racing Magpie, and I encourage folks who are on the call today to just Google it and see the amazing exhibits. The one that you curated, how long ago was that, Clementine?
It was summer of 2017, so just over 3 years ago, and it's traveled mostly just regionally. And we, again, we're uplifting narratives of Lakota women in the area, talking about Medake Oyasin, which is a term from our community that means we are all related. And so we were just trying to tease out these different stories and ideas about the concept and hear women's voices.
And this is probably a good time for me just to throw out the concept of relationality. So, I think often in Native context, we take it for granted that we all have long histories and that we're tied to our ancestors and that we're tied to the future and that this is an integral part of our practice. And so I had the honor also of being a mentor to Clementine's sister, Mary, when I taught in tribal colleges. And so if you're looking for what that looks like, go to the Institute of American Indian Arts in the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts. They were actually a co-author with me on the Making History book that just came out with the University of New Mexico Press. So all of these centers of gravity that I'm just really excited we can share with you. So Emily and I have worked together for some time. I'm just going to segue into looking at her work right now. And what I really love about her is what a serious researcher she is, how she actually is very assertive about going into archival holdings. She wants to know what the histories are. In terms of her practice, she's an innovator. I ended up curating a show called Endangered at Occidental College in their museum, and they have a little gallery there. And she gave demos about a drip technique that she has in printmaking. For many of her pieces, when she was looking at environmental degradation in Florida, where she last taught prior to Wisconsin, Madison, she would take the paper she was using and actually have it bulldozed, and the dirt from the area that was a wetland that was being transformed to, I don't know, I'm going to be goofy and say an REI outdoor store or something like as silly as that, right? She actually got the dirt into the paper that she printed. So just a very exciting artist. And here, you know, she's looking at the history of Fort Marion and the history of these prisoners of war at the fort. And so she pulled these two pieces, I call them pieces of evidence. And you can see that these were housed at the Yale Beinecke collection. And she's reproduced these images within this piece, Remembering Not History. And she's drawing from a statement that I made for that show where I said, this is not history. This is still current. This is still alive. I mean, and I tell in the museum catalog for this show about visiting the fort for the first time and having my uncle at the fort and us really occupying it in a fashion that the National Park Service folks couldn't understand. You know, my uncle stood in the gates of the forest and whistled in his good Oklahoma way and said, boy, Dad was born here. You know, and the Park Service people just, you could tell they're not following at all, but it's true. You know, our grandfather was born in that fort, and they're not really interpreting anything near to that right now. They're still talking about cultural contact. So that's another to-do job out there. But this use of the archive and how she embedded this evidence into this picture, when I talk about it, I talk about these geese kind of flying west as if she wanted to take these young men back home, and what that looks like. So let me move on. Those two archival pictures bring to the fore something that I discuss in my book as the contrast picture. And there are three different types. I'm just going to do a little like dip in here. I don't want to spend a long time, but look at the book and I can talk to you more about this. But the composite, the us and them, and the before and after. Some of you may be very familiar with Lee Marmon, who is a very well-known native photographer from Acoma. And this used to be on the college dorm rooms walls when I was a student. You know, people always thought this was very funny. You see the date, 1954. Why is this funny? This is just a gentleman who's got on Converse, but it's seen as inherently humorous. And I use the scholarship of Jane Leiden to talk about imperfect mimicry. You know, this, when people laugh at this image, which is all it is an image of a gentleman, you know, sitting there enjoying a smoke in the sun, it seems humorous because he's breaking some code that's not his code, but that's the viewer's code, that this is a traditional modern. The same for Horace Pula. This was the cover of our museum catalog for Love of His People. This is the photographer's son coming home, having served in the military and taking part in a ceremony and wearing a headdress. These are not incongruent for the photographer or for the subject, but it's incongruent for the viewer. So we're starting to kind of bump into this idea of what is the level of knowledge that you need to be able to move in this field of scholarship. And even just asserting Native arts is a field of scholarship. You know, I think that's also somehow minimized. This is a us and them, so it's the traditional modern divide, but not in one person in these comparing photographs. So the photographs from Fort Marion that I showed prior of the prisoners that were in the Emily Arthur piece, this is kind of an us and them before and after kind of theory. This is Angel Decora. She was actually one of our first Native arts scholars. She went to Smith College. She's buried in an unmarked grave in Northampton, Massachusetts. Just an amazing individual. There needs to be more written about her. And this is known as one of the first photographs of a Native person ever. And this is Reverend Peter Jones, who's Welsh and Ojibwe, who was a missionary in Canada. And it's the same kind of, disjuncture between what's considered traditional and what's considered modern. And these are taken contemporaneously at the same time, right? So these kind of narratives, this is the most well-known one, which is the contrast picture, Tom Torlino. This is associated with the Indian boarding school movement. People recognize this now. There's a, Clementine, help me out. It's the Indian Boarding School Healing Coalition, that the name of that group. Do I have it right?
Yeah, I think so. There's multiple, but yeah, I think that's the one.
A lot online, a lot of activism in this area right now, and something that I write about. I think we recognize that this is wrong right now. This is my own group. So these are Chiricahua Apache children. They were taken from their parents at Fort Marion, St. Augustine, now known as Castillo de San Marcos. They were shipped to Carlisle, which is one of the most famous earliest Indian boarding schools. Egregious crimes against humanities, egregious crimes against children. And this before and after narrative is used here. And so you can see how horrific this is if you start naming people in this. And then even if you start looking at them closer, like these are babies, these are our children. These are our hearts. Can you imagine? I mean, we're dealing with this now with immigration at the border, ripping children away from their parents and jailing them. This is basically what happened to our folks, at the turn of the last century. And, I'm trying to just bring back humanity. So one thing that happens in a photograph, and I chose not to put it here, but you can find it easily. If you look at Carlisle Indian School, there's that famous picture, right, Clementine, of like how many children, 200 children in front of Carlisle. And this was the brainchild of Colonel Pratt. And they're dehumanized. So this is just a very simple move. And I'm tracking basically tools for how to humanize Native art and our physical evidence. And one is you just look at these poor dear children closely and you see the fear in their eyes, right? You see that they have been dehumanized through this process of stripping them from their family and making them into some kind of enemy of the government. They did not have any crimes, right? They're not responsible for any of this. And yet here, this is the US policy. Here's what our children should look like, right? They're sitting in their grandma's lap and they're smiling, and these are our dear hearts. I'm a grandparent now, so I'm really feisty about how we raise our kids and how we protect our kids. And so, if you're looking at the field of Native arts, just think about, these are human beings. And all we're trying to do is claim their humanity, right? All the artists are doing is just trying to claim some humanity, because we're still lacking in that today, I think. I'm going to let you jump in here, Clementine, a little bit. I'll just set it up. But the National Museum of the American Indian opened in 2004, and this was their cover. This was their cover. So I'm hoping those of you tuning in can look and be like, oh, I think this is a contrast picture. I hope you know this is a contrast picture. So this is a tool of warfare that was used in 1886 that we are basically mimicking ourselves now when we enter the world of creating an institution that is purportedly to highlight our culture and our wisdom, right? And I always say I'm a friend and occasional critic of the National Museum of the American Indian. I'm glad it's there. I've curated a show with them. I consulted with them. I love many people who work there. But this is what happens with an institutional narrative, and when your field has not been theorized properly, so that you can look and say, oh my God, we're creating more horrific war crimes. We're not being reflective, and we don't have a history. And part of this has to do with not having publications, not having the same supports, not being legitimized, not having art store banks, a lot of knots having. It results in this kind of thing where Native people themselves are engaging in practices that are not liberatory, right? That continue to keep a divide and an exceptionalism at play for how we think about Native arts. So I'm getting off my soapbox, Clementine. I'm gonna let you jump in here.
I'll jump on the soapbox. I think it's frustrating because we are so desperate to be seen that we will repeat this historic narrative, this historic image of ourselves, and then be like, look, we're contemporary people as well. And being able to this notion of living in two worlds, right? I always kind of cringe when people use that narrative, because I'm like, I'm a current living Lakota person that really enjoys my my coffee, my brewed coffee, but I also can go to ceremony and do things simultaneously. And I think operating in institutions, any type of institution that stems from settler ideology, helps perpetuate this idea that we can only be seen as human when we're historicized and put in this historic frame. And I think, again, just kind of diving off your book, the Knowing Native Arts, you, in your introduction, you talk about how do we not leave open wounds, right? And I think when we continue to place ourselves in these contrasts, we're like opening the wound further and being like, you only see us as historicized and not, but we're actually not facing that narrative when we create these contrasts. We're just saying, hey, look, we understand that you only can see us as historicized people. And when I say you, I mean the general popular, like, settler audience. And I think that's what, if we go back to like Tom Jones's humor, right, within this, like these plastic kind of landscapes that he creates, we see the humor in that, and we understand it as kind of other Native people who have experienced some of these traumas or see that we're not represented in particular ways as current humorous people, right? We're only seen in these two kind of operating narratives that often don't humanize us. And like you said, Nancy, that's what you're really trying to get us to really understand. Like, the institution doesn't really want to humanize us, but we have artists that do.
Yes, thank you. I love the way that you frame that, Clementine, because the level of dialogue that you're engaging in is exactly the level of dialogue that I think we need to operate in. And when we stay with the older tropes, we never get beyond that. And, I always look to K through 12 education. We just don't know enough. And so I get, I think I put this in the preface of my book, I'm dealing with college students and have a third grade education about my topic. A third grade education, because that's the last time they visited any Native subject matter. And so, we're inheriting this all along. And actually, just last week, I did a public presentation in which we had a little bit of a tussle about the level of dialogue, because there was a question in that Q&A period where one of the respondents in the audience really wanted information about what is a potlatch. It was like a definition. And one of the people on chat actually gave a definition that the listener wasn't satisfied with that. And it became this big push and pull with the museum about, well, you have to answer the potlatch question. I was like, no, I don't have to answer the potlatch question. That's like, what is a bank? It's too simple. Like, I am talking about other issues. Don't keep me wedded on that level. The other example I love to give, and I'll give it really briefly, is our dear James Luna, who's no longer with us, who used to tell the story of going to a college art association meeting. They always just have one panel, if one, on Native arts at those. And he'd done a great presentation. I want to say it might have been with Jean Quick-to-See Smith, some other really well-known Native artists. And the first question up was, can you tell us about crop circles? Are they really made by aliens? And James just, burst in laughter and was just like, I'm not even going to entertain that question. No, I don't know about aliens. We're talking about contemporary art right now. And so I want to try to fix that problem, Clementine. And it's hard because we get caught in a reactive frame, and so how do we think outside of that? We're coming to the end of the PowerPoint here, but let's go back to Tom Jones, because this is how you think outside of that. So he loves using these small plastic toys, and the statements he's making here are multiple. I mean, one of them is just, again, to K-12 education, how do folks learn that Native people can be toyed with and played with and manipulated and are objects? Well, they have plastic objects that they toy with and manipulate and play with as if they were playthings. And so, yes, you learn this from a very early age. So he's taking these little plastic Indians and putting them on the scanner base. And if you look closely, you can see their bodies just in shadow up above. And the other important movement that he does here is he makes the size very large. So this is his niece who's posing next to, just so you can get an idea of scale. And he's taking that miniature thing that's been used to control Native people. And as a Native artist, he's blowing it up and controlling you as the viewer, right? With this power. And then he's also being very joyful. He's just like, you know, when I look at this, I think, oh, wow, those are beautiful colors, you know. So I just want to end with like another example of how our artists are working within these constraints and, you know, playing with the tools that exist and expanding the dialogue to a level that is really reflective of our lived realities. So that's it. I'm going to stop screen sharing unless there's something you want to look at. Clementine, do you want to go back to anything?
No, I think now would be a great time, right, to turn to any questions from the audience or any questions from John.
Yeah, so I'll just introduce myself. My name is John Blakinger. I'm an associate professor of art history in the School of Art here at University of Arkansas, and I will be moderating the Q&A. So if anyone in attendance has a question, you can use the Q&A feature at the bottom to ask a question for discussion. And I was thinking that I would maybe just start with my own question as some of the audience questions come in. So one question I have, Nancy, is about the role of the institution. And I mean, you've touched on this many different times, and I wonder if it might be helpful and productive to sort of focus in on this. I guess my question is whether you see institutions, whether you know, museums, universities, you know, maybe they're government institutions, whether you see them as a detriment or a benefit in terms of framing new future-oriented narratives. So, I mean, are they standing in the way of thinking in more progressive ways about the past, about Native history, and also about the future? Or are they really the tool and the platform from which change really can be enacted? I mean, it seems to me like there's a push-pull, there's maybe a little bit of a conflict there. So I'd be interested to hear more about that, about the role of institutions.
Yeah, so I'll start, and then Clementine, you'll probably want to follow up a little bit here too. I want to answer on two different levels. So I guess I'll start by saying, let's think about the frame of capital. And by capital, I mean a variety of resources. So what can an institution give? When I used to teach Anthropology 101, you know, there's power, there's prestige, and then there's wealth. And those are independent variables, right? A policeman may be powerful. He can enact something over you, but he may not have prestige and he may not have wealth, right? You know, so I would like to look at that, and instead of having the institution kind of being the only frame of reference, saying the institution is one frame of reference among many. And really what I would like to see in a radical version of how this Native arts world might move is the prioritization of living communities. Right? What does a living community need? Could those institutions of power and prestige and wealth, so that's the thing about universities, is they often have all of those. And museums often have all of those, right? And so what can they bring to Native communities, rather than us saying these institutions have to be the portal for existence, rather saying what can the institution do in terms of its outreach to Indigenous communities and to give them the supports they need, whether that's expertise in health or habitat or, you know, water resources, all of those. So just kind of switching that frame. I know it does sound like a contradiction that I am both producing scholars in the field and saying that the field itself is highly problematic. And the way that I look at that, and I would just want to be really clear if there's any grad students online or undergrad students out there, the university is not your home, right? The university is a place you're going to go through and out of again. You know, I think too often it's sort of, you know, the pressures when you go for tenure and you're getting your PhD, it's like, it's got to be that or anything else, or my life is not worthy. You know, people will ask me, how did you come to choose to be in the field? How did you come? As if it was a free choice of mine. You know, I was told to do this by my tribal chairwoman to service my community, right? It's a whole different frame of interaction. And so I think it can be confusing, and especially if you're coming at this from an idea of reformation, to say, well, how can you prop it up and destroy it at the same time? I just want to get the credentials. I just want the students to have that Teflon coating on them, right? So that they can enact research that's powerful and potent outside of that frame. That frame is not the end goal. It's a bus stop, right? It's just a bus stop that you're going to move through. And that's true, I think, for any field in academia. I don't think this is specific to Indigenous peoples. I mean, if you're doing any research, you know, you're trying to, University of Wisconsin, we invented vitamin D. You know, it wasn't about, I want to be a professor. It was about, let's do something to help humanity. That's where public universities, I think, need to center their gravity. But I don't know, Clementine, I'll pass to you.
Yeah, I think just I wrote down, don't make the academy your home. I think that's such a great idea to hold on to, especially as a doctoral student going through the throes of the institution right now. And I think things need to happen simultaneously. We need folks who are going through the trauma of the university or institutions to ensure that there are folks in those positions of power or understand those positions of prestige and understand where the wealth is going or coming from, so that when they do dissolve, because they will eventually, that we are able to navigate those pieces into something that looks more like community care. And I think especially now coming in our 8th or 9th month in the pandemic, this idea of mutual aid, it's there. I think there are structures in our minds that we're putting our communities and our people first above places of wealth and property. And I think that these things have to happen simultaneously, that we need people in all these different places to be able to navigate what happens next when these institutions of power, wealth, and prestige fail, because they are already failing. But we still need to be in these places simultaneously to navigate them and to think about what happens next.
Great. Maybe building off of some of that, and also, Nancy, some of your own comment. I mean, another question for me around some of the sort of contradictory relationship that you're presenting around institutions is maybe also about the field itself. And Nancy, you mentioned this. I'm wondering if you can say more about that relationship. I mean, how does Native arts fit with contemporary art? I mean, do you see them connected? Is there a friction between them? You know, whether that means in terms of academically and, you know, art criticism and art history, or in terms of exhibition spaces or how they're covered or studied. What is that relationship, and is it a productive one, or is there some tension? I'm curious to understand more about that.
Clementine, do you want to start, or do you want me to start? You want me to start? Okay. So I had this interesting thing that happened recently, and thank you, Janine, for pointing out that I've got this other book coming on the Venice Biennale. I had a great colleague who had me teach a class, and she asked at the end of it, you know, can you tell us how those Venice Biennale initiatives enhance the careers of those artists so that they could move more fluidly in the mainstream art world? And my answer was, no, that wasn't my mission. That was not my goal at all. You know, my goal is not to create artists that are successful on a Western reference point. You know, my goal, or actually the goal of the organization that started Going to Venice, was to create work that was not commercially oriented on a global stage, to basically just experiment. You know, let's all go, let's get in, let's move around. And at the last Biennale in 2017, one of the artists came back from looking at all the pavilions and said, my work is as good as that work. And I was just like, success. I don't want anything else. It doesn't matter how many people come. It doesn't matter if anyone writes up about us. It's that one person who felt like they were okay on the inside. The Institute of American Indian Arts, where I started in the tribal college system, with having Clementine's sister Mary as one of my students, you know, the premise of that art school is it's changed over the years. And of course, there's different leadership, but the original premise was to just make Native people whole and healthy, and to happen to do that through the arts. You know, when we go to Venice, it was like, let's just gather. I start with a quote by Jim Logan, who was at the Canada Arts Council for many years and is recently retired and is also an artist. And he said, Native people just like to gather. So while we're all gathering over here in Venice, let's put some art up on the wall. You know, many of the works that we did, I would have a hurried writer come into Venice and say, hey, I need your object list, and I need like the bio, and I need that. And I would say, well, you know, many of these pieces were communally made. And we do have a thesis that is thick and interesting and compelling, but it's not an individual. You know, we created this as a group. So all of these pushbacks. So I guess, you know, to answer your question, I can't be a rapprochement between Native arts and Western arts. I'm not constituted to do that work. And I don't think one person can do that work. And I'm not even sure it's productive as a mechanism to make Native communities whole and healthy. I'm not sure. So I have a big question mark, but I don't know. It's a great question. And let me pass it to Clementine.
Yeah, I think I will build off of your question, John, and simultaneously try to answer a question from the Q&A. Summer asked, she said, thanks for sharing about Racing Magpie. Do you have any advice for getting a physical space and building a community while keeping the space Indigenous only? I think for one, if we're thinking about these discrepancies of the institution and where they don't align with like Western ideas with Indigenous art making or current Indigenous artists, I think the one thing is institutions could do is to give land back. I know you mentioned this earlier, Nancy, but just this idea of wealth and space and resources, that's one thing a university can do, and be unapologetic about it. We're giving this space, this land, or an institution, right? A city could do that. I think about San Fernando, who has worked with the Tatavium, and there's art, you know, they have community space and a park in San Fernando, and the Tatavium are not currently federally recognized within the current US government system. And I think about a place like Racing Magpie, who just were like, we're going to find a space that is just for, you know, they opened it for all artists, but it's specifically catering towards Indigenous artists in the Northern Plain region. And I think we have to stop trying to fit within these dichotomies and just do it. And it's uncomfortable and it's scary and people don't like it. But we're building those things so eventually it'll catch on. And I think, like you said, Nancy, just not trying to conform so that we're legible, and just continuing to be like, this is what we're doing as Indigenous people. And if you don't like it, then you can move on. And then also, I think with being within the academy is then with the credentials, we're critiquing the people, like you do in your book, right? Or in the article that you just recently published, or the journal, special edition journal you just published with the UCLA American Indian Studies Center. But this critique of like the identity politics then that we have to play, because curatorial practices are like, well, they can self-identify. And I think, no, and this is where it comes back to like community collaboration, doing what the community asks and wants. I think those are the things that we can't necessarily do in the academy. So again, it's coming back to this, things happen simultaneously. Like, we have to acknowledge that the Western art spaces are there, but I think there's so many things that are happening outside of that just continue to happen. And so what we have to do in the academy is critique those Western art spaces while also upholding like Indigenous community spaces. And that's not always easy to do, but I think that's what you've been doing, Nancy, is like navigating these spaces simultaneously. And now it's up to other people, other non-native people in the Western world, to then hold themselves accountable to communities, even though they might not have those connections. But it's like pausing and being like, okay, what wealth and resources and prestige can I let go of to ensure that the future of Indigenous arts is taken care of and not having to conform to these Western ideas.
Great, yeah.
There's another question that came in that I think builds really directly on a lot of what you've just articulated, Clementine. And it's really about, who gets to speak about that past. You mentioned identity politics, and this has been an issue in many recent controversies. Nancy, I know this is something that you have thought about in your own work. So the question is, who gets to speak, can you speak to who gets to tell the story? I think of the difference between Jonathan Wack, a South African, making the film Powwow Highway versus Chris Eyre, a Cheyenne Arapaho, making the film Smoke Signals. So is there, in terms of identity politics and claiming the past, is there a sort of precise definition of who can do that? Or, it's very obviously a fraught and controversial topic, but one that's also ongoing. So maybe you can speak to this issue.
Do you want me to start, Clementine? Okay, so one of the publications that came out this fall is with the American Indian Culture and Research Journal. It's a UCLA publications, very well regarded, one of our oldest American Indian Studies scholarly journals. And I was fortunate to work with 13 other authors on a volume dedicated to fraud in American Indian communities. And so there's instances not only in the fine arts, but in children's literature, in dance, in legal courts dealing with hunting rights. And so the question that comes up there is, there's a legality about how Native arts move, how they're funded. And there's the Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1990, which was passed, of course, now 30 years ago. And we still have issues where folks are getting government funds intended for American Indian communities, and yet folks are really often fraudulently presenting themselves. I want to be clear, though, that identity politics for me is a term that is you can't recuperate it. It is a term that is so laden. It's often, I've done where I don't talk about stereotypes anymore. I talk about conventional narratives, because stereotypes are inherently negative and it just leads you down this one path. Whereas conventional narratives open up, and the book, Our Indian Princess, is about how Native folks have conventional narratives about non-natives, and it goes both ways. So I think the same thing with identity politics. I think about that as a very particular time period, and then it was used as a weapon kind of for a far right wing kind of political orientation, and we can't really recuperate that term. So, I think I would probably feel more comfortable talking about like ways of belonging, or how you self-identify. Right now it would be positionality and in the arts. And so who gets to tell the story? There's not one story. That's the whole truth about it. When we look at the monument controversies, right? There's been one story with monuments, and it's all about white settler colonial value systems, right? There hasn't been another story. And so I think just broadening it so that we're not feeling like we're competing with each other all the time. There are multiple stories, and the sooner we can get to that sort of point of, there's not an objective truth, there are only subjective truths. Having said that, the academy is, let's go back to power, prestige, and wealth. The academy is all of that, right? And so I think school is cool. I tell all my little cousins, get in there, get your Teflon coating, move in the world as you want to, and tell as many stories as possible, and open up more doors for other people as you're doing so. So I don't know if that directly addresses, but I'll let Clementine chime in now with her observations.
No, I think that is, it was a great way to answer that there are multiple stories and multiple ways to tell the stories. And I think There's another, sorry, Colleen, to skip over your question, but I think there's a question in the bottom here that kind of builds off this idea. It's how do you negotiate for the end of program alternative methods for program completion? And this is in response to issues in the institution within traditional ideas of dissertations as authored and owned. And I think, again, this goes back to this multiple narratives, multiple storytelling, but how do we navigate that, right, within a research institution? And I think another part is that we are just telling one aspect of the story. I think the problem within the academy, right, is a single authorship, or that this is the one story. And I think my main advisor, David Shorter, is always like, there's multiple ways of saying something, right? And so it's just figuring out how am I articulating this one strand of a longer interwoven braid of stories, right? And so I think that also comes back to this, who gets to speak and who gets to tell the story. And I think that is often the issue in the academy is who is in control of the narratives and who is promoting what narratives. And that continues to be an issue. And I think trying to navigate it is what I'm trying to do as a student, and then Nancy's been doing, for a very long time.
Yeah, I'd like to just say, like, one practical thing, Clementine, as you're talking, I was thinking about, I've been really privileged to sit on PhD committees internationally in Canada, Australia, Norway, Aotearoa, New Zealand, and seeing programs that are blossoming within Indigenous arts, where there's a PhD in Indigenous art, where an artist will actually create a show and then theorize the show in a long thesis. That's a standard practice. Artists have to go to New Zealand to do that practice right now. Why can't we build exciting programs like that will allow, I'm not quite sure what this alternative forms are, what that reference is, maybe someone can tell me later on, but those exist. The world is doing that. Indigenous people are doing that. We just don't see it that much in the United States. And then I just wanted to add something, because I know we're running out of time, but the idea of what happens within the academy, we always think of it as, you get that prestige and you move on. And it's tied now more than ever to work and to jobs. And I'm happy to try to train people and get them in those. I want people to have houses and healthcare and families and all of that. But, I think the larger good is what everyone said education was all about, and that Indigenous peoples deserve, which is you get to go find your voice. You get to mature in a safe setting. You get to read whatever you damn well please want to read. You get to make whatever you want to make. Like just that time in life where you can claim your selfhood. Native people need that just as much as anyone else, right? And often, we're being called upon to service the institution, redeem us, sit on a committee for us. Why don't you do this labor for us? And it always makes me angry, because it's pulling my students away from just exploring great ideas and just reading. That's where I want folks to sit in the academy, without all these other kind of pressures to perform, even though I know that those are real.
Great. Maybe we have time for, I think, one more question. And there's a question that I think builds off of all of this. We've talked a bit about navigating these issues as an academic, as a student, for example, but there's a question about how artists navigate some of these issues. So how do you think Indigenous artists negotiate different audiences? Or can a single work both awaken the US to Indigenous rights, but also transform or mobilize a Native nation, for example? Or are those two separate conversations? So I think it's the question is really getting at, who is viewing some of this work? Is the audience presumed to be also Native, or is it maybe a wider public that is not necessarily Native? And are those different goals or intentions for the Native artist?
Clementine, do you want to maybe reference the theater world? Because I know this is something you've thought about a lot there.
Yeah, I actually, I know I am a millennial, I'll admit it, but this next generation that is utilizing TikTok, I think I've been so blown away by the artists, young artists who are creating these TikToks sharing culture and current representations of themselves that are seen like around the world, and they're not, you know, creating these contrasts or working in this dichotomy. Like they're just, you know, participating in a dominant platform while also just being 100% themselves as Native people. And I think that is one space that I've just been so fascinated with and so excited about, to see young Native people represent themselves as artists in this platform in these 30-second little stories. And I think that's one way that I think they're kind of disrupting this stagnant narrative of this, you know, Western art in this particular way. But I do think that's one way that I see Indigenous artists negotiating and navigating that space, but not catering to the specific conventional narrative, but really just being like, this is who I am and this is the platform that I can do that on.
Yeah, great question. Thank you, Clementine, for that. I wouldn't have come up with that. So that's why I'm so glad you're beside me in this talk. But I'm going to reach to the elders then. So I watched the PBS on N. Scott Momaday recently, which is so great. And if you don't know of him, he's a Pulitzer Prize winning author. He's Kiowa. He's a beloved elder. And the question of audience came up, and he said something along the lines of like, you have to be a creator, to be an artist or a writer. You do that not for an audience. You do it because you have no choice but to do it. Like you must write, you must craft, you must produce. Like, you know, you have no choice. That's the reason you're doing it. You know, it's not doing it for an audience. It's because that's who you are as a person. So if the person who's asking that question, if you feel like you are a maker, and you are a thinker, and that is the space that you move in, just move in that space, right? The other stuff can come, but if you get that other stuff muddied in too early, I mean, I call it the golden boy and the golden girl complex. You know, we see plenty of really great Native artists who are latched upon and placed out in the public eye, and they never get that craft down of, I'm going to explore a new subject matter. I'm going to use a new medium. My ideas have changed because of a political movement. You know, they become a flat line, and it's because of the audience and what the audience has done to them. And remember, our audience for Native arts is ignorant. I'm sorry, largely. They're uninformed and lazily so, right? There's tons. We've been creating magazines, we've been creating shows, we've got catalogs, we've got so much information. You know, the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, we just got money to photograph those images, how many, 200, because we had to get an NEA grant. No one's even seen that work before, you know? I mean, we are doing amazing stuff, but it's just so the willful ignorance of our audience that hasn't really made the effort, and they have to be motivated. So I guess I'll leave us on that question of what will motivate an audience to actually be an informed, helpful audience, instead of an audience that is ill-prepared to understand how to think and talk with Native work. We don't have that yet, and there's no motivation. In fact, the motivation is exactly the opposite. The motivation is to consume the sweet, shiny stuff. And I honestly, I don't know if anyone has ideas of how to get beyond that, please let me know, because I haven't been able to crack it yet.
Great, thank you, Nancy. I think that is a great place to end, with that sort of provocation to, I mean, all of us in the audience today, to be motivated and to have that motivation guide us in learning more. I think that's a great comment to end on. And so I wanted to mention, as we conclude, just two things. First of all, this talk has been recorded, and it will be available on the School of Arts YouTube channel. And then also, if you have any additional questions for Nancy, she would be happy to take them and receive them by email. And so you can email her at mithlo@g.ucla.edu.
And also Clementine.
And Clementine, I don't know your email address, but Nancy, I suppose you can forward Clementine's on.
I can. And Clementine has a website, and I do as well. So if you want to learn more about her craft or other things I'm up to, please look at those URLs.
Great. So please join me in thanking Nancy and Clementine for sharing some of their work with us today, engaging in discussion. And I look forward to seeing everyone at the next art history talk next semester. So thank you and have a good night.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Janine. Thanks for hosting us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.